Our program tonight, as you all know, is the Middle East peace process. Our guest is Ambassador Dennis Ross, who I think has done a number of notable things. I think he almost uniquely represents continuity between the administrations of two different great political parties. And I think in the process he's earned himself a place in American diplomatic history. Let me briefly remind you of his career. And I know Art Abramson won't let me neglect to say that he's a PhD from UCLA. His career in the service of the nation began in the 1980s during the Reagan administration. He was a member of the policy planning staff with responsibilities for the Middle East. He then served from 1982 to 1984 as Deputy Director of the Office of Net Assessment at the Department of Defense, focusing primarily on Soviet, Middle East, and broad military balance issues. From 84 to 86, he was in academia as Executive Director of the Berkeley-Stanford Program on Soviet International Behavior, and then came back to Washington 86 to 88 on the National Security Council staff as Director of Near East and South Asian Affairs. In the Bush administration, he served as Director of the Policy Planning Staff beginning on the 21st of January of 1989. And of course, the Policy Planning Staff was first headed by George Kennan. And during the Carter administration, Anthony Lake was the head of that organization, a centerpiece in principle of State Department thought. And he served in that position throughout the Bush administration, with the exception of a 2-month period, September and October of 1992, when he was in the White House as assistant to the president for policy planning. At the beginning of the Clinton administration, he became special advisor to Secretary of State Christopher, and then became special Middle East coordinator. As such, he serves as the Secretary of State's point man in managing U.S. involvement in the Middle East, the negotiating process, and dealing with the parties in the negotiations. Certainly the Middle East is one of the few areas of American foreign policy today where there is distinct continuity. Mr. Ross personifies that and is a central figure in it. It's with a great deal of pleasure I know that all of us look forward to his remarks tonight, and it's my very great pleasure to present Ambassador Dennis B. Ross to you. Ambassador Ross.
When you work on the Middle East as long as I have, you learn to be resilient. You learn to be resilient if for no other reason than the distance between where we are and where I often have to be is obviously a great one. On this most recent trip that I came back from with the Secretary of State, somebody on the trip asked me, "How many times have you been there?" And I said, "Where?" "To the Middle East." And I said, "I haven't a clue. I mean, I know that I've taken 7 trips in the last 2.5 months, but I basically don't count beyond that." And they said, "Do you ever get tired?" And I said, "Do you mean, am I ever not tired?" And they said, "I guess that's what I meant." Resiliency is actually a pretty good way to describe this process. I have been in it for a long time, and one of the things that is striking about that is that there was a period when we used to talk about the peace process. Now, that was a period when I first started working on this, when in fact there was not a peace process. Because the peace process suggests that you have some kind of direct engagement that produces an evolution of conditions. But in truth, for a long time, we didn't have that at all, because there was no direct negotiations between the parties. We didn't have direct negotiations between the parties until we got to Madrid, which was in 1991. So for a long period of time, I worked to see what I could do to promote peace, but I really didn't work on the peace process. The peace process came along, in my mind, only after 1991. Now, when you look at it from that perspective, you get a sense of how far we have come. You also get a sense of how long people have hoped that there, in fact, would be a peace process that would yield results. I one time said that every American president, since President Truman, has wanted to be the president that would put his stamp on ending this conflict. This, after all, is one of the most intractable conflicts in this century. And we sit today at a point where talking about ending this conflict is no longer a dream, and is no longer an illusion, and is no longer something that is necessarily distant. And that's one of the ways to get a sense of how far we have actually come. We sit today in a Middle East that looks very little like the Middle East of even a couple of years ago. I one time gave a speech in which I said that we are on the threshold of being able to translate the possibility of making peace into a reality. And at the time, I treated it more as a theory than as a fact, because that was at a point when we actually began the negotiations, the real negotiations, starting after Madrid. And the negotiations went through different phases. Initially, after Madrid, we went through what I call the talking at stage. In any negotiation, especially when parties haven't had a chance to deal directly with each other, you have to go through the talking at stage. What does talking at mean? It means you talk at, but you don't listen to. Now, it's not that surprising, because if you haven't dealt with each other, you have to go through a period of ensuring that the other side understands all of the angst that you feel. And we certainly went through that stage. We went beyond that to begin a process of talking to. But talking to in itself doesn't guarantee that you begin to figure out how you'll solve problems together, or how you create what might even be called a common thinking group, which ultimately is the essence of what makes negotiations work. There aren't a lot of tricks to negotiations. In fact, negotiations work best when each side comes to acquire a degree of empathy and a degree of understanding about the nature of who they're negotiating with. Everybody knows their own positions very well, but rarely do they fully understand the other side's positions or the sources of concern or suspicion that may motivate that. And we have seen in the various negotiations a transformation take place in each of the tracks that moved you towards the ability to produce agreements. And when you look at where we are today, and you look at the various tracks, whether it's the Israeli-Palestinian track, or the Israeli-Jordanian track, or now the Israeli-Syrian track, we've seen an evolution. Some have evolved much more quickly than others. But the fact is, all have evolved. And it's the evolution that has created the prospect to create a very different kind of Middle East. Now, I gave a speech, actually just before I came over here, in which I was trying to put in perspective how far we have actually come. And I used as a point of departure the Rabin assassination, which reflected a great national trauma in Israel and a great national tragedy. It was for us as well, because Rabin had been our partner. Rabin had been not only a good partner of the United States, but Rabin had been a pillar of this whole process. His assassination was not only a shock, but it was the kind of thing that perhaps in a different period, some would have predicted that the assassination itself would have undone the process. And yet, here again, I use the word I started with, the process was resilient, because there's something much more fundamental about this process that responds to the needs, the desires, and the aspirations of the people of the area. Those needs, desires, and aspirations don't spring from the United States. All the parties may look to us to help them, but their interest in peace is not a function of us. Our interest in peace may well be a function of our national interest, but we're not the ones who create an interest in peace or the need for it. We can recognize why it serves our interest. We can recognize why there's a moral basis to pursue it. We can recognize why there's a humanitarian interest in pursuing it. But all of those factors in and of themselves are not going to create the impulse or the desire for peace. That has to spring from within. And we have seen that, and that's one of the reasons that there has been a resiliency in the process. Because fundamentally, leaders and peoples in the area want a different kind of future. They want a future that is without conflict, that creates a basis of hope, especially for their children, and creates some sort of prospect that the life will be very different. In one of the more poignant moments in one of the negotiations, I recall sitting with two of the negotiators, and one of them said, "I'm not doing this because I have a mandate from my leader. I'm doing it because I have an order from my children." Now, there are a few things that could be said that are more likely to have a profound effect on who you're negotiating with than having that kind of an impulse, that kind of an emotion expressed across the table. Here again, oftentimes negotiations are seen as being highly technical, without emotion, and carried on by people who in a sense are technicians. My experience in negotiations is that the negotiations that work best are the negotiations that reflect real emotions, real feelings, and the ability, again, to communicate and develop a sense of empathy. In the aftermath of the Rabin assassination, what one saw in Israel was not just shock, but a sense of renewed commitment and a sense that the legacy that was left unfulfilled had to be fulfilled. Now, that legacy is actually quite a remarkable legacy when it comes to the peace process. Clearly, there's a remarkable legacy in terms of the U.S.-Israeli relationship that Prime Minister Rabin had an awful lot to do with forging. But the legacy with regard to the peace process is nothing short of striking. And one of the best ways to understand it is to go back to July 1992 when he became Prime Minister. At that time, we had had negotiations since November of 1991. There were no agreements. Israel's position within the Middle East was basically an isolated position. Israelis didn't travel except to Egypt. And the fact is, Israel's position vis-a-vis the world was much less open, at least economically, than it is today. When you look at the perspective of today, you have to be struck by how far we have come in terms of how much the landscape of the Middle East as we know it has been really transformed. Obviously, there have been a number of agreements since that time. There was a declaration of principles between the Israelis and the Palestinians that had three phases. The first phase was to be carried out in Gaza and Jericho. The second phase was to be carried out in the West Bank. And the third phase is the permanent status phase, where the permanent status issues are to be negotiated, and that's slated to begin in May of this year. There's also been an agreement between Israel and Jordan. And there have been other developments in the region in terms of two economic summits which brought together Israelis, Arabs, both in terms of governments and in terms of the private sector. Kinds of meetings that in the past would simply have been unthinkable, and yet now they're becoming rather commonplace. I recall when we launched the Madrid process, we had a bilateral negotiating process and we had a multilateral negotiating process. And one of the reasons for the multilateral negotiating process was to deal with those issues that couldn't be handled only on a bilateral basis, but also it was to expand the orbit of Arab states that would be dealing with Israel. And this involved working on issues like water and arms control and refugees. And the purpose, as I said, was to expand the orbit of Arab countries dealing with Israel. Now, the fact is, prior to July of 1992, those meetings took place in the United States or in Europe. Starting after that, we began to see those meetings taking place in the Middle East itself. And so Israelis officially began to travel to a number of Arab states where they hadn't been before. But even that is much more restrictive than where we are today, because Israelis travel routinely to Morocco, to Tunisia, in very large numbers to Jordan. They've traveled to Oman, to Qatar, to Bahrain. The whole area in terms of interaction is different than it was before, and that's one of the legacies of the Prime Minister. Clearly, the agreements that he negotiated with his partner Shimon Peres opened up the area and transformed the area as we have known it. And those agreements and how they were reached are themselves indicative of the kinds of changes that have taken place. I have never been involved, as I've said on a number of occasions, in as complex a negotiation as the Israeli-Palestinian negotiation was on the interim agreement. The interim agreement was an agreement they negotiated to fulfill the second phase of the Declaration of Principles, and it brought the Palestinian Authority responsibility in the West Bank. What made it enormously complicated was that the Declaration of Principles called for the redeployment of Israeli defense forces from the populated centers in the West Bank. It called for, throughout the interim period, Israeli responsibility for the security of all the settlements and all the settlers, and there's about 150,000 that live in the West Bank. It called for a complete transfer of authority from the Israelis to the Palestinians in all spheres of life, and it called for Palestinians to assume responsibility for security in certain areas and responsibility for public order in others. Many people have thought that the most complicated part of that arrangement was really something that was negotiated only at the end. And in fact, this was a period when I was very active on the phone and the term telephone shuttle diplomacy was coined. And I can tell you that that period was very intense, but it did not reflect the hardest issues. The hardest issues were the ones that were really negotiated a couple of months prior to that time. And that's where the Israeli concern and need for security was reconciled with the Palestinian needs. And that's the point at which they came up. And I won't go through all the details because this is not only a complicated agreement, and it may well have been negotiated by people who were not simply technicians, but they had an ability to put things on paper that reflected how they could deal with the other side's concerns, no matter how difficult the issue. And what they were trying to do, after all, was to create coexistence, a new basis for coexistence for peoples, even while they were creating a separation. And that in itself is not a simple task. What motivated both sides was something very basic, that they wanted to ensure something that they had in common. For the Israelis, they didn't want to rule another people. They did not want to be ruling Palestinians. And Palestinians did not want to be ruled by Israelis. That common premise helped to infuse and to motivate and inspire what it is they did. And they worked out understandings on security arrangements that were difficult but ingenious, and it reflected this kind of mutual empathy that that is really required if you're going to be able to produce complicated kinds of agreements. And they went through an extraordinary experience of producing it. I once described their experience as being that of 200 negotiators brought together basically to operate as if they were at camp, because they spent 5 days a week, they spent all their time together. They broke down into very small groups, and they dealt with every issue that you could conceivably come up with. At one point, when I was with them at the hotel where they negotiated in Eilat, I was struck by the fact that all the groups were entirely commingled, and you really couldn't distinguish who was who. You had an energy group, you had a security group, you had a water group, you had a road group. I mean, whatever the issue was, you had a group for it. And the result of that was to create an extraordinary dynamic between the two sides that didn't have either side giving up what was important to them, but had each side recognizing that if you were going to negotiate an agreement, you had to take account of the other side's concerns and the other side's needs, or you weren't going to get there. And through all sorts of difficulties and tremendous pressures, they were able to get there. And we helped them, there's no question. But if they hadn't felt the need to produce it, all the help in the world from us would not have been sufficient to produce it. And we see already the fruits of this. The Israelis have redeployed from 6 of the 7 cities on the West Bank. The 7th is Hebron, and they'll redeploy from that in March after a bypass road is built. There are the first elections for an elected Palestinian council, which will take place on Saturday. And you've probably been reading some of the accounts of the campaigning. When you have 670 candidates for 88 seats, you're going to have a lively election. And it may well be that they don't have our tradition of elections, but the fact is there is a vibrancy to this, and it's significant because it is in fact an election that will begin to create more of the underpinnings of a democratic base for how Palestinians will rule themselves. And that has a long-term significance. What they have achieved, what Israelis and Palestinians have achieved, is historic already. The job is obviously not done, but we're already beginning to see a change in the relationship between the two. And that's no small achievement, and that's one of Prime Minister Rabin's legacies. A second of his legacies is the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty, which in many respects, is not just a peace treaty, it's a treaty of peace and cooperation. And the very last, one of the last implementing agreements that they had to conclude was a transport agreement, which they have just concluded. Already, over 100,000 Israelis have traveled to Jordan, and almost an equal number of Jordanians have traveled to Israel. And it demonstrates that the elements of what was sought in this peace are already being realized. Some of the economic benefits are also already being felt. Revenues from tourism in Jordan have gone up dramatically, and all one has to do, if you want to see some of the fruits of peace in the place where peace has been negotiated, is go to Jordan, because you'll be struck by the amount of building. And it reflects one of the positive things about peace. Peace can't just be on paper. Peace has to, in fact, begin to show that it pays, that there's a result, that it's positive, and that people will feel the results, because then they will develop a stake in it, which helps ensure that the peace will endure. A peace that doesn't deal with what I like to call the stuff of peace is really something that is only limited to paper. And if our exercise was only to help the sides negotiate pieces to be on paper, it wouldn't be worth the effort. It's worth the effort because we can truly transform the area when you begin to create the underpinnings, the economic underpinnings of peace. And that's something that will apply in all the areas, whether it's the Palestinian-Israeli agreement, or the Israeli-Jordanian agreement, or an Israeli-Syrian agreement, or an Israeli-Lebanese agreement. Ultimately, one of the things that has to happen is to ensure that the Middle East is not left behind. And we're already beginning to see that that's one of the factors that is influencing many in the area. There was an Amman Economic Summit that took place the end of October of this past year. It was the second in the string of what are to be a series of economic summits. The next one will be in Cairo in November of this year. The purpose of the economic summits is to create a new economic reality in the area and to create a very different kind of cooperation in the region. To give you a sense of where the idea of the economic summits came from, I should recount a little story. A couple years ago, in November of 1993, I was sitting with then Foreign Minister Shimon Peres, and he said to me that we ought to work to have an economic summit in Amman, Jordan. I want to set the picture for you. This is 2 months after the Declaration of Principles between the Israelis and the Palestinians, but there is no peace agreement at this point between Israel and Jordan. And Shimon Peres was suggesting we have to have a vision, and we should work to have an economic summit that brings 1,000 businessmen from around the world, 1,000 businessmen and women from around the world to Jordan, and brings Israelis and Arabs together so that they can begin to emphasize the possibilities of investment to really change the economic circumstances of the region. Now, I'm known by most people as being someone who rarely shies away from a good idea or rarely tries not to create ideas himself. And in my wisdom, I said to him, well, Shimon, I think we're at a point that's still evolutionary, not revolutionary. Now, from the perspective of 2 years later, you can see who was right and who was wrong. We've now had 2 of these economic summits. We had one in Casablanca that took place in October of 1994, and it brought together about 1,500 businessmen and women from around the world. That was a summit that broke the taboo on direct economic dialogue in the region. It didn't produce business because what it really reflected was an interest and a curiosity, but it didn't yet reflect the kind of impulse to start doing business. You got to start somewhere, and you start by breaking taboos to begin with. The Amman Summit, which took place a year later, is one where business was being done, and where the idea of ensuring that the Middle East would not lag behind, the idea of the private sector in the Middle East, Arab and Israeli alike, working together because it was in their interests, not because anybody was telling them to do it, because they could see the profit to be made, because they could see the results of it. That was all intrinsic. And what it reflects is there is an idea there. There may be competing ideas in the Middle East today, but one of those ideas is clearly an economic idea. And it's motivating those within the region to begin to transform it, not just in a superficial way, but in a more fundamental way. That, too, is one of Prime Minister Rabin's legacies. Now, we have to complete the circle of peace, as we like to say, because if you're really going to change the landscape, you have to settle you have to settle all the elements of the conflict. And clearly, an agreement between Syria and Israel would then help to produce an agreement between Lebanon and Israel. And in doing so, you would complete the circle of peace around Israel, but you would also accelerate the process of normalization in the area as a whole, between the Arab world and Israel. And so the last track that we are working on at this point, and I shouldn't say the last track, the track that we are focusing our effort on at this point is in fact the Syrian-Israeli track. Now, this is a track that has had ups and downs. We have had discussions for several years. We've had a number of points where we began to make a little bit of headway and we narrowed differences, but we've had a hard time ever sustaining and creating what I would call a genuine dialogue. In fact, only recently have we created a genuine dialogue. For those of you who live here and know the Eastern Shore, we made a decision at the end of last year, and both President Assad and Prime Minister Peres agreed to it, that we should take the negotiators to the Y conference centers on the Eastern Shore. Now, we did that because we wanted to create an environment of much greater informality, and we also wanted to create an environment where the negotiators would be together all the time as a way of changing the character and the quality of their discussions. And the initial set of discussions that we had went on for 6 days, and they were, in fact, very successful, because what we saw was a qualitative difference in terms of how the sets of negotiators talk to each other. We saw for the first time on this track a really genuine, meaningful dialogue. Now, that's a necessary condition for success. It's not a sufficient condition for success, because basic differences that exist are not artificial and they will have to be overcome. But what we began to see for the first time on this track was a willingness to approach differences not in a dogmatic or ideological sense, but we began to see a willingness to approach differences in a very pragmatic sense, that when differences were identified and they emerged, the reaction to those differences was, all right, I understand that, now how do we overcome the differences? What practical way might we solve the differences? This has a very different character than anything we've seen before in this track, and it gives us a reason to be hopeful that we can continue to make headway. We like the Y so much that we're returning there again next week for another 6 days, and we'll see if we can build on what it is we've done. Ultimately, if we're going to be successful, as I said, we have to produce agreements that don't just have a political character. That's the starting point. If you don't have the agreements at a political level, you're not going to create the economic underpinnings that can help to sustain the kind of interests that give each side, for their own reasons, a stake in what it is they've agreed to. But what we have already is a Middle East that looks very different from the Middle East of a couple of years ago. And so much of what is now taken as commonplace is something that would have been unthinkable before. Last year, in preparation for the Amman summit, I recall being in Amman and having a group of Israelis, Tunisians, Jordanians, Egyptians, Palestinians, Moroccans meeting together, and at the end of the meeting, which was itself the kind of thing that was unprecedented before, I went out to talk to the press. And nobody wanted to ask me a question about the significance of this. I kept saying, don't you recognize how important it is that these kinds of meetings are now taking place? And everybody, all the journalists who were there from the area wanted to take it as a given. It wasn't unusual. Well, you know, the more we make what in the past was unthinkable routine, the more we have succeeded. Ultimately, the measure of peace is that we take what was abnormal and make it normal. We take what was unthinkable and make it routine. And the real challenge that motivates us is to try to make the Middle East a place that is both normal and routine. Why don't I stop there and I'll take questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Ambassador Ross has agreed to answer questions until 10 minutes after 7. I'll repeat the questions only if they're asked from the floor. There are 2 microphones. Yes, sir.
Ambassador Ross, would the United States be willing to accept the partition of Lebanon between Israel and Syria if that were a necessary price to pay for a comprehensive Middle East peace settlement?
No, our position on Lebanon is that Lebanon needs to be an independent country that has control over all of its territory, and our objective and our hope is that one of the results of the peace process is that we will see that kind of a Lebanon emerge unquestionably.
Yes, sir.
Those critics of the peace process, both in Israel and in Jewish communities in other parts of the world, including this country, base their criticism on the fact that we really can't trust the Arabs. And they point specifically to some of the speeches that Yasser Arafat has made in Arabic that have been somewhat more militant than he has made in English to the general press. And specifically, when he refers to our assuming Jerusalem as our capital, and the Israeli position that this seems to be one area that is non-negotiable. I was wondering what your comments would be and what your prognosis would be, even though I know that's postponed, understandably, until the end of the process.
Well, there's a lot of different questions embedded in what you've asked, and let me pick and choose among them. I mean, I think you're asking two different kinds of questions, leaving aside the third question, which was a question that you yourself said is reserved for final status, and so I won't preempt that. The first question is, can you trust those who you're negotiating with? The second question is, how do you trust when you see that there are different statements being made in Arabic and English? Let me take the questions on in the following way. On the issue of statements that are made in Arabic versus English, I'm often struck by the fact that I've heard that a lot. For a long time, many of the people who were critics would say, well, it doesn't matter what they're saying in Arabic, it matters what they're saying to us on the outside in the West. And they're not saying the right thing, so therefore, whatever it is they're saying in Arabic doesn't matter. Now, when they're saying what are seen as being the right things in English, then they say, gee, but what are they saying in Arabic? I think what motivates those who raise the questions is obviously a skepticism, and skepticism is understandable and appropriate. I would also say that one of the things that tends to separate people when they look at this part of the world and they look at the issue of peace, if I were to create a spectrum, I think the spectrum would be those whose hopes tend to dominate their thinking, and those whose fears tend to dominate their thinking. And here I'm treating this purely from the perspective of those who are well motivated, who don't oppose the principle of peace. There are extremists on each side who basically don't want peace, don't believe in it, and will do everything they can to fight it. They're off in a different corner. I'm talking now about those who genuinely would like to see peace, but they get their view of it is sort of affected, as I said, either by where they fall on the hope-fear continuum. One of our tasks, I'm giving you an answer that is a lot broader than your question, because this is something that is a pet theme of mine, so I might as well give it. One of our tasks is to try repeatedly to ensure that hopes will dominate fears. Because when hopes dominate fears, what you see is leaders have room to make decisions. They have room to be creative. They can stretch their own imagination because they have the political space to do so. When fears dominate hopes, it's just the opposite. Everything is constricted. Clearly, the more success that you have in this process, the more the hopes get justified, and the more you will see a tendency to tilt towards the hopes dominating the fears. Those who want to draw distinctions between speeches are not wrong in doing so, but there's also a great deal of selectivity. The fact is, there are speeches that Chairman Arafat has made, and there are statements he's made that we've had problems with, and we've told him so. But those have been in Arabic and English, and there's also been statements that he's made in Arabic and English that have been extraordinarily good. The fact of the matter is, one thing that one has to keep in mind is that for a millennium, the Palestinian answer to the Israelis was always no. He is the first Palestinian leader in history to say yes and deliver on it. He became the Israeli partner for peace. That's exactly what Prime Minister Rabin said. Will there be ups and downs in this process? You bet. Because again, there's a legacy that has to be overcome. But if you look at where they have come, given where they started, it really is a remarkable change. And when you see, in fact, that on both sides, while fears continue to exist, on that spectrum of hopes and fears, the tilt is more in the direction of hopes now. And that's obviously something that's very positive. I said that was a question that's best left for permanent status, and it's best left for permanent status.
Mr. Stern?
Mr. Ambassador, in the past few months, the United States has tilted quite perceptibly in favor of the Muslim government in Bosnia, in Sarajevo. And we are now in the process of arranging training of Muslim forces in Bosnia and arranging the equipping of these forces through various Islamic countries. My question is this. Has this policy in any way affected the attitude of Arab nations to the whole Middle East peace process?
No, I wouldn't say that it has really affected the attitude towards the peace process. I think that the attitudes towards the peace process are driven by the local realities in the area. I think generally there is a great deal of appreciation for us in the Middle East and the Muslim world for having taken decisive steps to try to bring the conflict there in Bosnia to an end. And I think there's a perception that without American leadership it would not have happened. So from that standpoint, I think that there's greater appreciation of the American role, but it has not affected attitudes towards the peace process per se, other than the fact that I think it has probably enhanced in their eyes the value of the American role in the Middle East.
Yes, ma'am.
Water is one of the most important and complex issues that the Middle East peace process has to grapple with. And with the watershed being in the Golan Heights and the West Bank, I'd be interested in any information that you could give us about what is being discussed and how this can be resolved.
It's a very good question. Water is, in fact, a key issue and has been, in the negotiations so far, something recognized as a key issue. In fact, in the Israeli-Jordanian negotiation, it was an agreement at the end on working to increase water availability in Jordan, steps that the Israelis could take and steps that the international community could take that helped to finalize that agreement. In the interim agreement, one of the last issues to be dealt with there was also the issue of water, not rights, but allocation, and how it could be increased. And here, there were extensive discussions with us, and one of the things that we created in the process before the interim agreement was concluded was a trilateral between the United States, the Israelis, and the Palestinians. And one purpose of that was to focus on investment in water with the express purpose of not only trying to expand what was available, but in a sense investing in water over time. Clearly, water is also an issue that has to be addressed in the Syrian-Israeli negotiation, and it has to be addressed in a multilateral basis as well, and from a multilateral perspective as well. I'd like to make what amounts to a more general comment on the issue of water than what I've mentioned so far, because in a sense, in each negotiation, it has had a role. It is obviously an issue of concern. But it is an issue that needs to be addressed not only in terms of conservation, reducing the amount of waste and loss, recovery of water that is today lost in terms of floods or in terms of what's in wadis, and even being willing to treat sewage for irrigational purposes. All of those are important ways of expanding the existing water. But none of them, in effect, grow or increase the amount of water that is available. And here is one of the areas where real help from the international community and investment over time is going to be necessary. because one can deal with water needs over the coming decade, but when you project the water needs in the area out over the next 20 to 30 years, and you compare it to the demographics, the problem becomes much more acute. And here there's a need to be able to look at this with a longer term perspective and focus on those kinds of approaches that may make a difference. And there, in some cases, desalination becomes more cost effective over time than it is today. There is one of the agreements that emerged from the multilateral process was to create a desalination center in Oman to focus on this kind of work. And it reflects, again, the kinds of changes that aren't always visible or particularly prominent, but suggest that there is an increasing recognition of commonality of some of the concerns and some of the problems that are, in a sense, true to everybody there. There are problems in the Middle East that don't respect borders. And as a result, you have to come up with solutions that transcend the borders. If we are to really transform the Middle East and create a new Middle East, the approach to water is going to have to reflect that.
Mr. Tietzer.
Yes, sir. The Middle East, which of course includes countries that are not just Israel's immediate neighbors, but also other countries like Iraq and Iran and Libya, basically have relatively unstable governments or governmental systems, oftentimes led by dictators. Now, the United States has for several years now been pushing and frankly manipulating Israel into these peace agreements, although obviously the Israelis want peace for their own reasons. But I still recall back when George Bush was president how the United States actively got involved in the Israeli elections to help Mr. Rabin get into office by basically threatening to withhold various types of financial aid and making other, public statements in the press. If the circle is closed with peace with Syria, which would probably be another disadvantageous peace, and that they would lose strategic territory and be further forced into what amounts to a sort of a ghetto type of country instead of one with defensible borders. Is the United States foreign policy then going to be to push for disarmament so that Israel will wind up being in the position that Bosnia was in 3 or 4 years ago?
Well, earlier I got a question that had several parts. Your question has several premises, all of which are wrong. The first premise is that the United States is manipulating Israel into agreements. The United States is not manipulating Israel into agreements. Israel is reaching these agreements because Israel believes that peace is in its interest. Now, obviously, Israel is not interested in peace that sacrifices its security, and neither is the United States. And obviously, Israel is not interested in a peace that isn't going to be enduring. But the choices that are made with regard to peace have been Israel's interest, not the United States. And that's the way it's going to remain. Israel makes these decisions on its own. Israel will decide not only what is in Israel's interest with regard to peace, but what is in Israel's interest with regard to security. It is interesting that Israel has probably never been in as strong a position as it is today, politically, economically, or in a security sense. Israel isn't pursuing peace because it's forced to pursue peace. Israel is pursuing peace because Israelis have decided that it's in their interest to pursue peace. Most Israelis want to live a normal life. Most Israelis want to live in an environment where they don't have to worry about what the future is going to be in terms of conflict. Most Israelis have grown up in an environment where they had to deal with the prospect that war was an everyday possibility. They want their children to live in a different kind of environment. They make that choice, not us. They will continue to make that choice. If, in fact, they arrive at agreements, and if, they seek our help in doing so, which they have, they'll continue to have it. But the decisions that will be made in terms of peace will be Israeli decisions. They won't be an American decision. The peace that they're making is with their neighbors, not with us. They already have a good relationship with us, and they're going to continue to have a good relationship with us. And as I was saying, one of Yitzhak Rabin's legacies is that the relationship between the United States and Israel has never been so strong. Now, the second premise was that we would push for disarmament and disarmament of Israel. I think if you look at the history of the relationship between the United States and Israel, one of the things that comes through clearly is that the United States is committed to Israel's security. We have made it very clear we're committed to Israel's maintaining its qualitative edge, and that the commitment in this regard is unshakable. It's not going to change.
Yes, sir.
Sir, since the Israeli-Egypt peace agreement, I guess there was an initial euphoria, and then the unfortunate assassination of Anwar Sadat. I guess what I get from our press is that the situation has kind of degenerated into a cold peace. I've always felt, unsure whether that is the case, whether the press is reporting that correctly. Can you shed some light on just what the situation has been and what the prospects are?
I don't tend to take a thermometer and measure the peace, but I think the point you raise is a very legitimate one. Clearly, there is a peace between Israel and Egypt, and the peace at one level has ensured no conflict, and it certainly helped to change the military equation in the Middle East. And that's obviously of interest. In terms of the peace embodying all of the kinds of functional and practical relationships we'd like to see, in terms of it embodying the kind of stuff of peace that I described before, we'd clearly like to see much more of that. It is interesting that these summits that I referred to, these economic summits I referred to, are in fact moving forward, and one measure of how much the Middle East itself is changing, and this economic idea that I referred to has a kind of power, is reflected in the fact that when the Amman summit was held, there were 4 Arab countries competing to see who could host the next summit, the next economic summit, that, as I said, brings together Arabs and Israelis both from the governments and from the private sectors. Well, it turns out Egypt is the next host of that. And clearly, each time we've held a summit now, we've had 2, we've seen a progression. And the progression clearly moves in the direction of enhancing the level of cooperative economic projects. So the fact that Egypt is hosting that is, I think, something that's important and may give an impetus to the Egyptian-Israeli relationship, especially in the private sector and especially in the business area. I would also note that Egypt is going to be the host of the Middle East Development Bank. And the Middle East Development Bank is something that we strongly supported after Israel, Egypt, the Palestinians, and Jordan came together to basically make a common presentation on its importance. The purpose of the Development Bank is, again, to foster economic development, economic investment, and even economic integration. So there are a couple of practical manifestations that should move us more in the direction of creating some of what I described as the stuff of peace in the Egyptian-Israeli relationship. From our standpoint, that's very necessary, it's very important to promote, and we will continue to push it in a very strenuous way.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I would like to know the U.S. government position on 3 issues that were not raised today. The 2.8 million or 3 million Palestinian refugees, Jerusalem, and stationing of American troops on the Golan Heights. Thank you.
On the first 2, which are refugees in Jerusalem, those are permanent status issues, and one thing the United States has not done is to adopt positions on the permanent status issues. What we want is the parties to negotiate them, getting back to an earlier question that in effect implied that we manipulated the Israelis. The fact is, we're not interested in laying out an American position on what the outcomes ought to be. We want the parties to negotiate them and reflect their mutual interest. On the issue of troops in the Golan, I think you have to take a look at this in terms of what is important in terms of an agreement and in terms of security arrangements. Some kind of international presence on the Golan in the event that there is an agreement is something that both sides have suggested they would be interested in. Both the Israelis and Syrians, however, have also said they are not interested in talking about that at this stage because they see the international presence as derivative. It's not a substitute for security arrangements. It is something that might complement or reinforce the security arrangements. And the security arrangements for them that are important involve early warning, military confidence-building measures or transparency measures, and zones of separation, which involve demilitarization of certain areas and limited deployment zones. Now, until you know what kinds of arrangements they've agreed to in those areas, those three areas I've just described, you really are not in a position to have any idea of what kind of international presence you're talking about. Would it be a purely monitoring presence? If so, what size would you need? There has been, since 1974, in the Golan Heights, 700 members of something called UNDOF. They have been there since 1974 because there was a disengagement agreement between Israel and Syria at that time. This has been a border that has actually been Israel's quietest border. There's not been a single incident there since 1974. Clearly, if the two of them reach an agreement, they've demonstrated they can control their own territories. And if, in fact, they want a presence from the outside, and if they want the U.S. to be a part of it, that's something that we would obviously be prepared to talk about with them. But they have not raised this. Back in, I think, November of 1994, Prime Minister Rabin, when he was here, said to President Clinton, and said it publicly, that if there was an agreement with Syria, he looked to an arrangement much like the one in the Sinai. There are multinational forces and observers, of which the U.S. Is one of the spearheads of that, and it has a monitoring function. That's something that he at least saw as a model for the future. But we really have not had a discussion on that because, as I said, it's premature, and it's premature largely because what really matters here is whether or not you produce an agreement on security arrangements, obviously, as well as part of a much larger agreement that involves all the elements of peace.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask about foreign aid. Currently, Israel and Egypt take up the lion's share of our foreign aid, and it is going to be cut by the Republicans, it appears. How does the State Department feel that money should be now allocated throughout the Middle East? Should the portions stay about the way they are? Should more countries receive it and cut back on the amount given to Egypt and Israel? Or is there even any need for that kind of tremendous amount of money in the region now that peace is there, the economic development is there, and that money could be used elsewhere to help other countries?
Well, I think there still is an important value in making certain that those who make peace and who run the risk for peace see the material benefits of peace. We are not looking to change the assistance that's provided to Israel and Egypt, the Camp David countries. Obviously, we look at the issue of assistance as something that is a critical instrument available to the United States in carrying out foreign policy, and in providing an instrument that can be used not only to promote interest but to preempt, either promote peacemaking or preempt the possibility of conflicts. And I think our view is that if you look to cut foreign assistance, which after all is a minuscule part of the overall budget, if you look to cut it, then you're basically denying us an instrument that is quite cost effective. It costs a whole lot more to send troops, not only in terms of money, but in terms of the risk to blood as well. And for a fraction of sending troops, if you can preempt those kinds of possibilities from emerging in the first place, you're really better off. So I think the issue of foreign assistance is one that needs to continue to be joined, but it needs to be joined with an eye towards looking at what in fact promotes our interests around the world, reduces the potential for conflict, and in a sense saves us a lot of money in the long run, not to measure, as I said, not to mention, as I said, the risk potentially in lives.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Ambassador, there are fiercely ideological and violent Islamic movements at work in Algeria, in Egypt, in Turkey, and in other countries of the Middle East. What dangers are posed by these Islamic movements, and what measures can be taken to ameliorate their effects?
Well, I think the Islamic movements need to be looked at clearly for what they are. And it's, in many cases, the extremists who try to use Islam represent a perversion of Islam. Nowhere have we seen governments that have been run by those who espouse extremist views on Islam be successful. They cannot provide a model of success, and in a sense, their appeal is very much driven by an ability to focus on grievance, to provide a simplistic explanation for the grievance, and to provide an even more simplistic prescription for how to overcome the grievance. I think the answer is obviously to try to remove some of the sources of grievance. Now, some relate to existing conflicts. Some relate to socioeconomic causation. Some relate to corruption where governments are corrupt and not particularly effective. And I think what is required is really an integrated strategy designed to deal with how you best take on some of the sources of appeal of these groups. But I think it's also important, as I said, to highlight that nowhere have you seen those who come to power be effective in any way, shape, or form. And I think it's important not to exaggerate the significance of these groups, because while they represent a danger, they have not come to dominate the area. And if you go back to 1979, and the view at that time on the part of many was that with the advent of Khomeini in Iran, this represented the wave of the future. Well, if you look around the region, the fact is I don't think it represents the wave of the future. It isn't to say that they're not significant, it isn't to say that they're not destructive, it isn't to say that they aren't a force that has to be dealt with. But I think it's also important not to exaggerate the significance. It is important to come up with a strategy that is coherent and has many different parts to it.
Mr. Hassler?
As somebody who's lived in Beirut, Lebanon, and has many fond memories of the American University there and its role in the Middle East, two questions about Lebanon. Number one, what's the rationale for the ongoing ban on travel by Americans to Lebanon? And number two, why is the U.S. government substantially reducing funding for the American University and therefore reducing its positive role in the Middle East?
Well, on the second one, we have in fact tried to sustain as much support for AUB as we could. I mean, the problem goes back to the earlier question, that we are sustaining very difficult cuts in foreign assistance. And inevitably what happens when that's the case is that many deserving projects end up being cut, not because there's a desire to cut them, but because one is faced with having choices that are very unpleasant. And that's an example of one that we have done as well as we could to sustain funding for AUB. On the issue of the travel ban, we don't have the travel ban on because we want to have it on. We have it on because there still is a concern about the level of security there, about the ability of groups like Hezbollah to be a threat and not to be responsive to governmental control in a way that would give us a higher level of confidence about the safety of American citizens if they were to go there.
And that, in terms of local tradition and grandness of spirit, is on this scale of the local things in proportion somehow to the magnificence of what you're involved with now on the international level with respect to the peace process. I know we're all very, very respectful of the role that you've played. We're in awe of the process itself, and we certainly wish you the very best, and we thank you for a marvelous evening. Thank you very much.